All right, here they come, Corey.
Welcome everybody. Good to see you.
Happy Thursday. Welcome on in to our Tier 1 Foundation webinar.
You know what's interesting, Megan? So my son's last day was like Tuesday. So there's educators out there with no kids in the building right now.
Oh my
And
goodness.
they're thinking like, I'm either thinking, why are you on? Or it's the perfect time to be on because there's no kids in the building.
I love it. It's like this part, which one? Is it
That's right.
why or I'm lucky? That's a good point. Welcome in everybody. Feel free to drop where you are joining us from in the chat. And if you happen to know, drop how many days of school are left. Or you could, as Corey just referenced, say, we are done. Maybe you're in that position. Oh, hi Bree, 15 days. That seems like a bit. You're in
Seems
there.
right, yeah. It's always funny because I think people are like, is it school days or are we just counting all the days? Like, because we're counting all the days and it's gonna be more.
Kids done tomorrow, Catherine. Wow.
Oh, man. Summer school already? That's wild. I get it.
I've always been fairly jealous of those educators that get done right before Memorial Day. Like, how great of a concept is that? Like, let's get done, the official launch of summer, and we don't have to go back.
That's right. Yeah. Though anymore, I feel like we're having all kinds of things in between summer, between the end of like this fall or spring and then into the fall with summer school, enrichment programs.
Absolutely. All right. Welcome everybody. We'll take a few more seconds to let some people come on in, and Corey and I are excited to be joining you today to talk all about our foundational Tier 1 work, how we get this right through an integrated approach, and really how we can take tabs on how we're doing and use that to continuously improve our efforts over time. So, Corey, are we ready to get started?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Cool.
Yeah.
Should do introductions first. I'll introduce myself. I'm Megan Gruss, Executive Director of Implementation here at Character Strong, and so excited to be on with Corey.
Yeah, and it's good to see everyone this morning. My name is Corey Notstein. I'm the Director of Tier 2 and 3 Solutions, and just really excited to join you from a not so smoky anymore Colorado.
Nice. Love that. It's not as bad here either. I am in Minnesota, and welcome to all of you. Love seeing where you're joining us from. So we're just going to start intentionally here in the chat. Define for us, what is Tier 1? We talk about it all the time. We talk about needing multi-tiered solutions. Then we really got to get Tier 1 right first when we think about that, and then let's define it too. So Corey, if I asked you, what is Tier 1, how would you define it?
I mean, I think it's always, trying to narrow it in, but the easiest thing I can say is it's every student. It's all the adults, it's every student. It's the thing that we do every single day consistently over time. And so there's probably lots of other definitions that are out there. I see people dropping it in the chat. I like that, firm foundation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What about you, Megan? How do you define it?
Lots of universal, lots of all. Yeah, I love defining it like every student, every day. Like, what are we doing daily and consistently for students? And we've always got to add something that's replicable, right? It's not like I did it today and I forgot about it tomorrow. Really what we're doing daily and consistently so that students can succeed. Yeah, love it. Absolutely. So before we dig in, let's do a little relational activity.
Oh, yeah.
So we've got the hot seat here. So for those of you that may or may not have the curriculum, this is one of our really relational community building activities that we have in our secondary curriculum. This is all about giving students choice in what type of risky question they want. So is it a really low intensity one, kind of a cool question, all the way up to an 8, which is a little bit of a higher intensity. So Corey, I'm going to ask you, how you feeling today around the hot seat?
Oh, let's keep it pretty cool, Megan. Let's go with number 1.
Oh, playing it safe, of course, playing it
That's
safe.
right.
All right, in the chat, everybody, would you rather be a master at every musical instrument or be fluent in every language? If you have an opportunity to type fast, type in your why. So I'm going to ask you, Corey, what about you? What would you rather be?
I don't know. It's such a tough one, but what I do appreciate is the music is universal. Everyone knows music. Everyone has it in their experience in their life in some way. And so I'd love to be able to play every instrument. I mean, that would be fantastic. And I think mostly it's because I have zero musical talent now. And I would love just to be like, one thing would be great. Could I play the piano or the guitar? That I would settle with that. But if I get them all, let's do that too.
That's great. We got a nice mix in the chat here. We got lots of fluence in every language and some musical instruments. Great. Love seeing the whys around knowing cultures, being able to communicate with anyone and everyone, being able to, like, sometimes music is just people's language, right? So being able to meet that as well. Very cool. Great. Thanks for answering that and just giving us a little taste of who you are today. So we're going to dig in how to create a strong tier 1 foundation, set the context for you first. So as we begin here, we are recording it. You are in listen only mode. The links and the resources are going to be shared in the chat. So be sure to keep your eye on the chat and feel free to also ask questions or use the Q&A feature to engage today. And we love that engagement and we'll be asking you to do that throughout. So today we're talking about that tier 1 foundation. We're going to first get into clarity around tier 1. What do we need to do to get really crystal clear around tier 1 and what that means in our systems? We're then going to talk about our approach to an integrated tier 1 and then talk through the necessary ingredients that we need in order to get tier 1 right. And then afterwards, here's what you can expect. Yes, you will be getting the slides and the recording. You'll actually get a link to a website that has the recording and any of the resources we dropped today, along with additional calls to action for you as you leave the space. So make sure that you grab that and share it with all your friends. And obviously, we are here to get you the support that you need. So at any time, reach out and we will spend a little time at the end answering your questions as well.
Yeah, and what we're excited to talk about is the whole child. So when we think about universal tier 1, that firm foundation, whatever you're describing it as, we're really talking about every single student and not just reaching their individual academic needs, but really addressing the whole student. And what we've been starting to think about here at Character Strong is like, what are the components that make up whole student support? And this graphical representation I really like, is it starts to build out like, what is it that's needed to increase belonging, well-being, and engagement? And we know we need a couple key things. Some of that is around MTSS and the solutions that support those practices. But we also need highly effective school leadership. We also need equipped educators with knowledge and skills and practices they can do easily, accessibly to all, and do them regularly and consistently. But we also know that we need to implement things well. And we're going to touch on some of those things. And we equally need to create a nurturing environment where students feel like they belong, they're welcome, they're recognized for who they are, they have that voice and choice. And we're bringing together families and community partners with our schools to create a place where everyone wants to be and engage regularly. And so today we're going to talk about equipping educators, right? You're here, you're engaged in learning. Megan and I are going to make it as entertaining as possible, but also hopefully have you walk away with some concrete things that you're going to benefit from and integrate into your school. So what happens when there's a lack of clarity? So we were just talking about that, like we're going to focus in on like getting really clear about what MTSS is. But if there's a lack of clarity within your system in relation to tier 1 practices, what happens? So in the chat real quickly, what happens when there's a lack of clarity in relation to tier 1? And Megan, what have you seen over the years of like, gosh, when we're not real clear about what it is we expect of everyone to support everything in terms of what a student needs, what happens?
Well, I think we get frustrated educators because we don't really know what we're supposed to be doing, when, where, and like how I'm going to be supported. I think like that's a big, big piece. If I'm not clear about what I'm supposed to be doing, how do I work to meet those expectations and then bring those expectations to life in my classroom and ultimately for the success of students?
Yeah, and people are dropping in things that I think we commonly experience, right? We
Mm.
experience confusion, especially when our leaders aren't explicitly telling us what it is that an educator needs to do day in and day out. We also feel frustration or resent those that are telling us the things that we should be doing, but we're not real clear about what those things are. And then ultimately start to pull away, right? Like we're just not going to be engaged anymore because clearly it's not a priority if we aren't real clear about what it is that we're supposed to do. And then opportunities dissipate for the ability for us to engage in closing the gap from the really good practices and interventions that we know we have in place to getting them to our students. And so that gap grows even larger from the good things getting to the students that can benefit from them. And so we like to think about like, what's the easiest way for educators to be able to start thinking about clarity and checklists, right? Like, I think Megan and I probably use checklists every single day just to get clear for ourselves about what am I doing today? And I'm sure many of you are like that too. Like, I like a good checklist, and a good checklist also gets really clear about what it is that we're trying to do. And are these things in place for educators? And you can see here around these, like, are we really clear with our leaders and staff about what tier one even is, right? Do we know the big ideas? Do we know the practices that are in place that every educator should be using? Are we really clear on why, right? Do educators understand the why behind what we're trying to implement and have in place? Do we have shared understanding of the outcomes that should come from our tier one practices? Do we know what role we play as educators in that? Like as a school counselor, did I know what role I played in tier one? Did I equally know what the paraprofessionals were doing in relation to tier one, as well as the teachers and administration? And then ultimately, do we have a plan? Like, is there a plan in place that'll help us deliver tier one with a high level of fidelity? And they're really simple. Is it yes or no? And I think we can start to do a checklist. But if you want to go even deeper, we've started to actually look at this document, and this is the tier one fidelity rubric. And we're excited about it. We're going to talk about it throughout this conversation today. So we'll drop a link in the chat for you so you can have access to this resource. We're going to come back to parts of it. We're going to reflect on it. We're going to think about our own practices in relation to certain elements within here. In the first part, just the image you're seeing on the screen is just the clarity part. We're going to talk about other elements that are embedded here. But having a rubric like this allows you to check in regularly and consistently across time to see where your program and your schools are in relation to, in this case, clarity, right? And so we've moved it into this fully in place, partially in place, not yet in place. And we can start to develop plans based on what's there or not there. So why tier one? Well, there's three primary reasons, right? And we're trying to put some preventative measures in place. We're also trying to promote and we're trying to enable them. But what do we mean? Well, we want to prevent difficulties or problems from occurring in the first place, right? We don't want to constantly be in reaction mode. We also want to promote access to experiences that optimize and enhance learning and good outcomes for students. And ultimately want to enable a solid foundation that creates intensive interventions in an environment that work, right? We don't want to experience things by accident. We don't want to stumble on outcomes just because we got lucky. We want to enable really good, effective practices on purpose to get the outcomes we intended. So let's think about this a little bit further. If we have some common language around tier one, what would it look like? You mentioned it in the chat already. Well, let's give it some like concrete language that we can agree on, right? And tier one is the foundation and represents enriched experiences that each and every student receives daily and consistently. And Megan hinted at this earlier. It's the consistently. It's not just once a week. It's not we're getting it right for a full week and we forget about it. It really is day in and day out. And when you think about that, and this leads us back to a conversation we had just a little bit ago about what are those core components of our work, one of them is related to engaging multi-tiered solutions. And so when we think about that, a good reminder, right? What is MTSS in general? Well, we're talking today just about getting that foundational piece right for students, the tier 1 for all, but there are tier 2 supports, and those are for some of our students. We also have tier 3 interventions, and those get more intense, and they're for a few of our students. But today we're just talking about tier 1. And what we're really looking about tier 1 is every student plus their holistic needs plus every single educator. So all hands on deck equal tier 1. So Megan, how do we integrate this work? Like, what does that look like?
Well, it's a challenge, right? It looks like dedication and consistency. So we think about tier 1, and often we think of like the solution to tier 1. What are we doing across tier 1 that the one thing that we're going to do is going to get everything right? And we've got to kind of look at, we have to integrate lots of different practices to create that solid foundation. You know, your house probably wasn't, if you have a basement in your house and it was poured with cement, like it's just not one thing that led to that firm foundation. It's like the mixture of all of the chemicals. We talk a lot about a recipe approach. So, you know, concrete isn't maybe something that really excites you, but maybe the chocolate chip cookie on the screen does. I don't know. Depends upon what time zone you're in or what time you're at. Maybe it doesn't depend. Like chocolate chip cookies are just good any time of the day. But what we want to think about is we can't get a chocolate chip cookie with just the chocolate chips or with just the flour. We'll talk a bit more, but we're really trying to create a consistent experience for students over time that's replicable. So we're going to talk about why integration is important and then really how we're going to do that. So a few data points for you here. This, you're just looking at sense of belonging. So we would kind of assume that sense of belonging is something that all schools strive for. We want a sense of belonging for our staff and for our students. This just shows some research that if we implement SEL strategies alone, we're not going to get as great of results in sense of belonging because we haven't really truly focused on practical relational strategies. So this shows a study where there was the integration of EMR, which is a relational practice, and SEL, and you can see sense of belonging goes up when we integrate. Another example is PBIS and SEL. We talk about that a lot. Some people think like, oh, they're not, they conflict instead of being complementary, and this is showing you it's complementary. When we look at SEL alone, we can see here, this is in relation to the reductions from pre to post screening measures. So think about universal screening measures and how students are representing both what's external behaviors and internal behaviors. So if you look in the blue, that's those externalizing behaviors. And you can see SEL alone has some work. Actually, like PBIS has a greater reduction, but when we look at PBIS and SEL for externalizing, that's a really great reduction. Same thing in the green there for internalizing behaviors. SEL supports the reduction of internalizing behaviors, PBIS a little bit, but when they're combined, that is where we get the greater results for students. So the data is very clear. We do need to create a very intentional integrated efforts around tier 1. So let's dig into that recipe approach and let's think about those chocolate chip cookies, okay? If we have a recipe for chocolate chip cookies, what does that recipe do for us? Really think truly. Go to the box, go to the cupboard or wherever you store your recipe, like pull out the card. Okay, what is this? Why did I go to the recipe? And for me, I don't bake and I really don't even like to cook. So, but I need a recipe. If I'm going to do anything right, I need those guidelines to tell me how to do the things I'm supposed to be doing. What's the right amount? Like, what's the actual ingredient? How do I do this well? Like, put them all together and what tools do I need? It's those guidelines. And within that, we're creating the outcome. So the recipe, if I go to my recipe for chocolate chip cookies and I get brownies, we're probably going to think, well, that was odd. It was probably the wrong recipe, right? I went to the recipe to create the specific outcomes that I was trying to create. We were trying to create something on purpose. So that outcome is what we want to achieve, or really what as a result of what we do. And then we want to look at the recipe is not just one ingredient. My chocolate chip cookies aren't going to be made just from the the bag of flour or just from the butter. We have to look at combining all of them to get the desired results. So we want you to just like sit on that, think about that. What is the recipe for your tier one success, and what are you combining together to really get the outcomes that you desire for students over time? So we've thought a lot about this here at Character Strong. We've done a lot of work and research with schools across the years. And here's what we have really come up with as the tighter recipe for you all to really take and try to internalize what are we doing with these 4 different ingredients. So let's think about this as our tier 1 recipe. If we have a recipe, we're combining ingredients, and our 4 ingredients are really around relationships. How are we developing relationships with students? How are we providing opportunities for purpose and agency? What are we doing to create a solid, safe, predictable, equitable environment for students? And then what are our core teaching and learning strategies and practices that we can really deliver anywhere, anytime? When we can get that recipe right, we can get those outcomes of what we call whole child success. It's that well-being, the belonging, and engagement that we desire for all students on a daily basis in our schools. So we want you to reflect and assess. We're going to go through each of these components of integrating whole child support. We're going to go through all 4 ingredients for you, and we want you to take that rubric that was dropped in the chat. It's the last thing in the chat there for you, and start to just internalize. Okay, like open it up on your screen as we go through our foundational ingredients. Just start to think through, where are we at in our school system really right now, and how do we continue to move that work forward?
Yeah, Megan was talking about those recipe elements, or the chocolate chips, the flour, the sugar, a little salt, not a lot of salt, just for those that are trying to make the chocolate chip cookies taste favorably. But our foundational ingredients when we think about tier 1 are these 4: relationships, purpose and agency, teaching and learning, and environment. And the first that we're going to dive into is relationships. Because what we're ultimately trying to create for you through this conversation, but always, is low burden and high impact solutions, interventions, practices that you can use daily and consistently. Because if they're not low burden, it's less likely that you're going to put them in place regularly. You're also less likely to use them if they don't yield some form of outcome that you ultimately want for students. And so we're constantly striving for that here at Character Strong. We're going to list a few of them as we talk about relationships, because ultimately it is all about relationships. When we think about the classroom environment without relationships, our students are probably more likely than not going to show up and engage. I've got a 3rd grader. He doesn't show up every day wanting to do school, so he has to rely on a relationship to move them forward. And part of that relationship needs to be consistent and predictable. We know when we have like consistent and predictable environments for students, we substantially reduce the likelihood that students will become dysregulated. I think more often than not, what we're combating in the classroom environment is dysregulated students, because that dysregulation impacts learning. And we see that across lots of things, and there's new research talking about that all through trauma and the impact of what a dysregulated student and their ability to learn looks like. So we're trying to spread that consistency and predictability across multiple areas, not just the classroom, but in the hallways, and in the, heading to the bus, in the cafeteria, on the playgrounds, in the common spaces in high school. So students know what to expect from us regularly and consistency. So it lowers their stress and increases their ability to emotionally regulate. So one low burden, high impact way that we can do this to create both consistency and predictability, but develop relationships, is through 4 at the door plus 1 more. Now, you may have heard us talk about this in the past. Maybe you haven't, but this is a common practice that we like to integrate as part of our SEL curriculum. And so what this looks like is eye to eye, name to name, hand to hand, heart to heart, plus an entry task. And you're like, well, what does that even mean, Corey? And it would look like me recognizing Megan right as she walked in the door, me calling her by her name and actually pronouncing her name correctly, right? And if I didn't know it, learning it, because many students walk into the classroom and don't have their name pronounced correctly, and think about how disengaging that is. It also can involve an elbow bump, a high five, some other fist bump, whatever it is that we're trying to engage. And sometimes at the elementary, they're coming in hugging, right? They're throwing the hip in there, getting a full hug. But also we're recognizing people. So, you know, Megan, it's a quick thing, right? So it's something I know about Megan. So I know that their son's playing soccer. I want to know like how he did that day, right? So Megan, it's good to see you. Hope things are going well. And I hope your son scores a goal because I know he's got a big match, right? And as you come in, but you got an entry task to get you started. We did an entry task when you came in, right? We had you drop your name and where you're located, right? Something just to get you started. And then we did a connection game to build on that. And so what we're trying to do is actually not only develop student to student relationships inside the classroom, but we're equally interested in that student to staff. And this is one way of a low burden, high impact practice that you can do to build a student to staff relationship. Equally important though is staff to staff. We need those relationships to be solid because we know as the year wanes that we're going to struggle actually throughout different parts of the year. And it's those relationships that bring us forward. So you don't have to do fourth door plus one more with just students. Think about as you're coming in for a staff meeting, what that might look like, and having staff engaged and actually be ready to go as we get started. We also know a couple of things if we do put these things in place and have the ability to develop social skills, which this does teach some of those practices around like how do you make eye contact if that's appropriate for the culture, how to actually engage with another adult, right? If they develop those social skills, they're more likely to go on to complete college degree and be employed full-time as young adults. And I think ultimately we want our students that matriculate through K-12 to get out there, engage in their community, be successful in the way they want to be successful, whether it's being employed or starting in college. We also know that they're through numerous opportunities to respond and engage, right? It decreases disruptive behavior, increases the correct responses and student engagement that we want to see every single day. And if we can do it consistently, we can actually start to reduce the number of dysregulation, and student engagement goes up because of that. But we can only do that if actually we're proactive versus being reactive. And so I'd love just to keep some momentum going in the chat there. You know, what are some of the proactive things that you currently do, either as an educator or that you're supporting educators to do? Because there is a big difference between being proactive versus reactive. We need to be both, right? We need to have skills to be able to do both. But we can't live in reactionary mode all the time. One, our students are dysregulated, and two, it takes a lot more time to be reactionary. You have to step aside, right? You have to pull students to small group settings. You have to pull them to the side because you've stopped instruction. And all of a sudden that's disruptive for the flow of the class. And so being proactive, one way to do that, as students enter the door, in addition to giving them the high fives, recognizing them, you can also prompt them with like, hey, I know you're going to struggle today, Megan, because we're going to be up moving around, right? I just want you to know, I'll cue you a couple minutes before we get up and move around so you can get moving, get your things ready, so you don't feel like you're going to be disruptive in that environment that you're heading into next. I wouldn't probably use disruptive with Megan. I'd probably use something more kid-friendly, but that's the word I used right at that moment. But those are things that you can do to pre-correct students as they transition different parts of the classroom. So let's do this. You had that tool. Megan asked you to pull it up. Hopefully you got it up on your navigation bar, because we're going to reflect on an element related to relationships. And so if you're looking at that document, you actually have to scroll a little bit down past those initial clarity checklist items into the integration of whole child supports. And actually relationship is the last one that's listed. And so we're taking a look at that. So just going to give you about 30 seconds to take a look at that, read that, and reflect about where you are in your own school environment or practices related to relationships. at the tier 1 level, right? That's a big piece of that. At the tier 1 level, what practices are you putting in place and implementing to support relationships at the tier 1 level? Megan, I'm curious, as people are reflecting, when you were in schools, what did you see? Like, what was your experience like?
My experience was like, at first, you'd ask educators, do you have relationship practices? And we'd say, yeah, absolutely. Well, what are they? And it was like a mix of what we were all doing. And no one was able to like really replicate, how do I do this for the same over time and like meet the needs of all students? And so once we learned more and like got better at it, when I like right at the point where we were kind of, when I was like exiting the school environment, we started practicing EMR. So establish, maintain, restore. And we would get some concrete practices in on how to establish relationships. What are we doing to maintain? And then how do we restore when there might be some harm that's happened relationally? And then we would check it, right? It's that implementation piece. We had our PLCs looking at that every quarter. I wouldn't say that that was best practice, but it was something that we were using some common language and reflection around. Are we actually developing relationships, and how good, like what kind of stage of relationship are they at? So.
No, that's great. And it lines up too with a little bit of what Lorraine was saying there in the chat. Like, you got to get in there and provide some professional development around specific practices that you want to see, and how do you support it and implement it well, and be consistent in your supports that help educators actually do that every day. We're going to come back to this reflection document or this rubric in just a moment for the next components of it, but we're going to transition into purpose and agency. And we're going to talk a little bit like, what does that ingredient look like in a school environment, and how might you have specific practices you could put in place? So just cue yourself, like, I'm going to come back to this. So be thinking about, how are we using purpose and agency in our own school environment? So we also know that, some things to just consider. Roughly half, right, 52% of 6th through 12th graders say they enjoy coming to school most of the time, right? And that we also know that disengagement leads to classroom management challenges, which we've talked about, which leads to actually educator burnout, right? A disengagement from educators. And the research also shows that when students are given choice, they experience an increase in intrinsic motivation. Effort, performance, and learning all grow with choice. So how do you do that more regularly and consistently inside of your classrooms? And so one thing that we like to think about is me and we, right? And what do we mean by me and we, right? How do we actually start to practice some of our values that we have inside of our school environment? And some questions that you can start to think about that help develop those values, right? And start to pull out students' own awareness of what's going on is by asking them specific questions, right? And so some of the questions we just threw up here as ideas for you. There's lots of other questions that you can actually create. But one of the things you can start to do is like, what did you notice? What resonated with you? How is this related to your life? Why does this matter to you? So by asking questions like this when you're engaged in instructional practices, it starts to pull at students' own lived experiences and ties their lived experiences into the learning that's actually happened, and starting to actually give voice to student, right? And it's not just Corey's lived experience, because he's the instructor in the classroom telling all the students about what it looks like. It invites students in. And by inviting students in, we get greater levels of engagement, even if they can't always access all the knowledge that's being delivered. They're able to bring their own personal story to the conversation. Some other things that we can start to ask is around the we part, right? What other perspectives did you notice, right? What might this mean to your staff, right? How is this related to students we serve, families? Why might this matter to people we care about, right? So when we start thinking about how staff might access this, these are questions. We can also think about this for students inside the classroom too. Like, part of this is about social perspective taking, right? How are we bringing in our understanding of how others might be impacted by what we're doing or saying, or living out our own experience in a common space. So these are specific things that you can start thinking about, like how do we bring up the values of others into the learning environment so they can feel more engaged and they belong in that learning space. One other thing to think about is actually student agency, right? In addition to purpose, right, that we were talking about. And student agency gets at this idea of how is it that students are able to engage in the environment on their own without always feeling like they need to be prompted or guided or pushed in some gentle way towards something. And if you're not familiar with this image that we have on the screen, it's the social discipline window. And you can see on the Y, I always get this wrong. I haven't been in science class for so long. The Y axis is the one going up and down. And the X axis is going horizontal. I think that's true, right? I can't remember. I think that's right. Either way, control's going up on one side, support's going across horizontally. So, and what this is talking about is when control, so control being like limit setting and having structures in place for students to be consistent inside the classroom and predictability. If there's low control, right, then we're actually not going to be able to get the outcomes that we want because we have low support, right? And as that control goes up, right, this is actually what we're talking about things doing to students. So like if we're overly controlling in an environment, we're actually doing things to students without actually giving them much choice or options. Equally across the bottom is support. And so when we're talking about support, we can think of things like encouragement, right? So if we have no encouragement and no control, we're not going to get any type of engagement, right? And we're also ultimately going to get no outcomes. But if we increase support, right, but without any control, we just keep doing things for students, right? We don't give them the opportunity to actually get the outcomes because we provide the answer for them, or we actually took away their autonomy or their agency to be able to do it for themselves. But when we have high control and high support, we go from doing things to them or for them to doing it with them. And ultimately, that's what we're trying to get to, this idea that students have the ability to do it with us. They're engaged because they have a sense of purpose, because they're allowed to get their voice in the environment. And they're actually able to engage because they have some lived experience that helps that. But also, they have agency because we've provided the consistency and the predictability through our control, but also done that through a high level of encouragement and support that drives students' desire to want to do those things. So what are just a couple types of things that you might drive student agency up with, right? And so some of those things that we talk a lot about in terms of low burden, high impact practices is really around the development of community agreements. So how can students and staff come together to say, like, what is our values and norms for the classroom environment? Right? That is just one simple way that we can start the year. Then we can come back to it regularly and consistently to have students be reminded about, oh, this is a practice that we adhere to in this environment. Right? Have we also taught students how to ask for what they need? I think that's a really important thing, is that we don't always teach students on how to access specific things or how to ask for help or how to engage in a learning environment where it's less structured or more structured, and what does that look like and how do you access that content? And then ultimately, there's another one option for you. Are students engaged in more desired activities after completing a less desirable task? So can we have students that may be somewhat disruptive, engage in a task that they don't like right away, right? But they're going to know if they complete it, they're going to get access to an activity that they like, right? So this strategy allows for students to get access to a choice behavior that they want when they actually complete the task that educators need them to complete. So let's take a look again at the rubric, pull that back up. We've got another section for you. The screenshots, the section that we're looking at, which is purpose and agency. So go back in there, take a look at that. We're going to give you just a few minutes to reflect on it. It's the first one actually in that section for integration of whole child supports. Take a look. The question is, educators are implementing effective tier 1 practices to empower students to have a sense of control and ownership over their experiences in schools. That's a huge thing, right? Megan, have you ever heard any fears that people have about this? Like, hey, I don't want to give students too much choice. Did that ever come up?
Yeah, that's a really good, yes, absolutely. And I think I don't know, I have a perspective on it. Like we went into education because we wanted to be teachers and we wanted to have the control and we wanted to provide the content and be the expert. And so I think that's where a lot of some of the fears, I'm just like generalizing, can come from is what happens if we let control go a bit in our classroom and really allow students to lean in and have their ownership over their experiences. And that can feel kind of scary, I think, at times. And we're like, oh no, what might happen? But it also goes to reflect some of these other ingredients that we're going to be talking about. Well, if we've set up the environment and we have good relationships, then we're able to do this a little bit more easily and calmly and be able to be okay with, it's okay if the students do misbehave a little bit or something doesn't go exactly right, because there's all learning in it. So yeah, that's a long-winded answer to your question, Corey. Sorry, but
No, I think it's good. I think it's a reality that, like, as we think about like how do we create greater voice and choice, like what are the things we might run into, like what are the people ask questions about, and what can we have as answers or data that might support increasing voice and choice. And it doesn't have to be every day. I think that's, not every assignment requires voice and choice, but how do you build it in more and more to be consistent over time? So students do feel like they have a say over their environment. I think that's important.
Love these two. I mean, if we think really about our purpose and agency and relationships, a lot of some of these strategies that Corey mentioned are part of our school culture training. That's what we do here at Character Strong, is we work really hard to give low burden, high impact strategies. And some of these little tastes of strategies are part of a larger experience that you can bring to your school culture training. Because sometimes you're like, oh, this is great information, but how do I do that? And we love to be able to offer you opportunities to really make this happen in your school setting. So love those strategies, especially that me and we, and really thinking through that S, how do we start intentionally, four at the door plus one more, all really great strategies, part of our school culture training. So we're going to move on to teaching and learning. This is it, right, Corey? Like teaching and learning is what schools are founded on. So I'm going to ask the question in the chat. Well, teaching and learning of what? What do we do in schools? We say this a lot, teaching and learning of what? What do we could think through the typical answer. We could think through our dream answer. Corey, what would you say to this? What teaching and learning of what? What do we do in schools?
Oh my gosh, there's so many things, but I think you're like, I think it depends developmentally, right? Like where are we teaching and where are we learning? But the reality is that regardless of the content, we're trying to make sure students are absorbing knowledge over time and then being able to articulate it in a way that, one, we hope they articulate it. Sometimes that's through assessing them, but also how do they apply it? I think applying knowledge is super important. So equally on the learning side, like how are students absorbing that information? Do we deliver it in multiple ways and modalities that allow for that? And so I think students need the opportunity to absorb information in the way that makes the most sense for them.
Yeah, awesome. Keep dropping those ideas in the chat. What is it that we're trying to create? We've got our little backpack. Think about what we're trying to really teach students and what we want them to learn. We want them to learn about their character, really develop character traits that help them to be productive and successful citizens outside of our context. I think about an example. I could tell you, to Corey's point last night, character being shown on and off the soccer field, right? It was very clear which teams might have a focus on character in their school and which teams may not have. Academics, right? We teach academics across the spectrum. We got reading, math, and we got writing, we got science, social, all of it. We teach social and emotional skills. We teach behavior. We do all of this. And so there's a lot of things, a lot of curriculum, a lot of strategies that we use. What we know is we teach students all the time and we're expecting them to really learn and engage in that. There are some core instructional strategies that we can use no matter what we are teaching and what we're expecting students to learn. So I just want you to think about the frame of, well, how does this apply to academics, or how does this apply to character? How does it, yeah, core instructional strategies apply across the board, whether it's from kindergarten all the way to 12th grade. And luckily, we have some really good folks out there by the name of Robert Marzano and John Hattie. If you haven't heard about them, please do. But if we think about Marzano, he's really high up there. Like he's like the educational researcher, really about high yield instructional practices for educators, really that educator teacher practices. When we think about John Hattie, he's done so much work around performance indicators and evaluation with teaching and learning and evidence-based methods about student achievement. And they have different strategies that they talk about in both of their work, but yet there are some strategies that they agree on. And so thinking through some concrete core instructional strategies is what we want you to really consider in this frame. At tier 1, what are those teaching and learning strategies at the core, no matter the content, that we would want to see, we'd want to feel, we'd want to be able to replicate in our classroom and school environments? So here's the first 4. It's a clear focus. So research says students need to have a clear focus and overt instruction about what it is they are learning at the time. So teachers need to be very clear on what they're doing, and they need to overtly teach it. Then we also need to have the opportunity for students to engage with the content. How am I engaging in it, really making it mine? And I need to have feedback. Whether that, when we need to think about feedback as both positive and constructive feedback. So I need to be given feedback along the time to continue with my motivation to do it. And then I need to be taught multiple times. Think about us as adults. If you're trying to learn something new, the multiple exposures that are required in order to change behavior. We also want students to work together. How are we creating the context for our students to collaborate, to learn from each other, more kind of that we part? What are we doing to create that environment, that atmosphere where kids can learn and engage and apply it, and also lean into their SEL skills? How do I build relationships? How do I problem solve with others? And then 7 and 8, we've got to build up our students. Building self-efficacy is so important. Do they believe that they can do the learning that is set in front of them? And then are they able to apply that knowledge in the day-to-day and real life context? So these core instructional practices, it does not matter what it is that we're teaching. This is what the research is telling us. Like, we've got to do this. Whether it's teaching an SEL curricula lesson, whether we're teaching behavioral expectations, or it's the math lesson at the end of the 8th grade year. These are the research-backed strategies that we know work to really improve student outcomes with whatever it is we are exposing our students to. So we want you to reflect again. In your context, are educators implementing effective tier 1 curriculum and instructional practices, really to teach that whole child success, the academic, social, emotional, and character competencies that we want them to be able to attain? So do we have educators that are doing that in our system? Maybe all of them are, maybe some, maybe few. Reflect and assess. So in that rubric, again, you can find the teaching and learning section, and it's your opportunity to think through how we can intentionally make this work happen in our systems. So pause for a second here, allow you the opportunity to reflect on that rubric. Corey, you've been in many, many schools across the country. Do you have any stories or experiences you'd love to be able to share just around teaching and learning, and how you've been able to see some school systems really grow in this area for student outcomes to improve?
Yeah, I think what's always interesting about this is that lots of educators know different practices, and some of them practice them better than others, right? Not in the sense that like they're doing it wrong, but we never give feedback about how that practice is actually being delivered, because I can deliver something with pretty low enthusiasm and it's still like an effective practice, or I can do it with some level of passion and conviction that actually drives the ability for that to produce an outcome. So some of that is just, do we spend enough time supporting and coaching educators, not about specific content, but specific practices? And so I think one thing we don't do as often as we should is probably create opportunities, one, for educators to go watch a master teacher utilize some of these practices, for them to test it out in a safe environment and they get positive or constructive feedback about how it is that they've delivered that practice. And then the last thing I would say is that, do we consistently have those practices in mind across all of our staff? And so getting our building leadership teams to like solidify what are the core effective practices that we're going to put in place around teaching and learning, and then keep providing professional learning opportunities around it. Make it a priority both at the beginning of the year, in the middle of the year, and at the end of the year, and then sticking with it long enough, right? I think that's the other thing, is just being consistent over time. So I think when people do that, they are more successful, because of your point, there's lots of strategies. There's lots of research around strategies. It's figuring out what's the right strategies for the environment that your school is contextually situated within. And I think that's super cool.
Love it. Bringing in that implementation and continuous improvement mindset, Corey. Judy, thanks for that comment in the chat. Exactly. We just learn piece of the pie that we have to remember is that reflective piece. We can just speak at people, but if we don't have an opportunity to reflect, oh, we are in or kind of a mess, right? We're going to, last but not least here, talk about our fourth ingredient, environment. What is environment? Think about it. What environment are you trying to create in your school system? If you could use some words, what would you want an educator, someone, a visitor, a family member, a community member, how would you want them to describe your school environment? What are the words that come to mind? What would you want people to say? Drop them in the chat. We'll see those come on in as we continue to roll here. We want nurturing environments. We want to move away from unsafe, unpredictable, reactionary, and exclusionary states. We want to move away from that to some of the things that you are saying on the screen. We want to feel safe, predictable, proactive, inclusive. I belong here in this environment. That's what we're trying to create. And those don't just happen unintentionally. We have to have very clear practices that we are putting in place. One of them that doesn't work is mind reading. So if we just expect students to be able to behave in a way that is congruent with our environment, it actually doesn't work. I don't know, Corey, do you have your license in mind reading at all?
I didn't get it renewed, actually. It's
shoot. All right.
Expired.
I'm gonna ask somebody else, but mind reading doesn't work. So we have to be very intentional to establish norms and expectations and explicitly teach students what the expectations are for behavior in the environment that we are creating. Another piece, we have to role model. It's one thing to teach, then we need to apply. To Judy's point, we have to model the behaviors that we want to see in our students. So we're going to do that as educators. We're going to allow students to model and really lean in and practice how we bring those expectations to life. We also want to create predictability. So it's important, yes, to have these expectations in, let's just say, one classroom context. Yet it's also really important that they know if I'm going from class to class in some secondary environments and even in elementary environments, that it's predictable. I'm not expecting one thing in this classroom and getting the exact opposite when I go across the hall. So we have common routines, we've got schedules, we've got supervision and educators that are following through with the expectations that are being taught. And we're reminding students. So just like we as adults need reminders throughout our day, we're reminding students to show what they know and show what they're learning around their behavior, and not going straight to punishment or exclusion when they may have a mishap or an error. We think about pre-correcting. Corey talked about this earlier. It's pre-correcting a student before they come into the environment. What are they going to expect, and how do we pre-correct it? So, hey, if it's something that, a student might struggle with, maybe they struggle with transitioning from, let's just say, math to Phi Ed. So we're going to pre-correct that. Hey, like, we're wrapping up our math lesson. You know what? As we go to Phi Ed, here are the 3 things that we're going to remember as we move into that space. So we're pre-correcting, encouraging the expected behavior expectations before an error might occur. We're prompting and reminding students to use those expectations. We also need feedback. We need feedback in a couple of directions. We need to be able to give positive feedback to recognize and acknowledge students. And then we also need to progressively respond when there are errors that occur. So we've got to have systems and structures to make this type of feedback happen, both on the acknowledgement side and on the corrective side. So if you've ever heard of it, there's this thing, it's called PBIS. Some people love it, some people don't, but it is tried and true how we can create this supportive, safe, inclusive, and predictable environment. It goes all through what we just talked about: establishing the norms, being able to teach and model, actively supervise, pre-correct and prompt, recognize and acknowledge, and progressively respond when behavioral errors occur. There's 20 plus, 30 plus years of research out there around PBIS, and it has really great concrete strategies that you can use to bring a safe environment to life in your system. So we want you to reflect. We probably will give you time here to reflect on this one, but just want you to be reminded in your rubric, take it out, open up that tab, look at environment. How are you doing in regards to creating the environment that you listed in the chat that you're desiring for your students? And we know that's one thing to really talk about it. It's another thing to bring it to life consistently over time. And what we're bringing to life is this recipe approach. The goal here is that we look at this tier 1 recipe not as separate things. Relationships don't just happen at the door. Purpose and agency doesn't just happen in a social studies classroom. Or teaching and learning doesn't just happen in the middle part of the 45 minutes that I have with students. An environment isn't just created in the first 2 weeks of school and the first 2 weeks when we come back from a winter break. It is integrated into everything that we do if we're going to get the outcomes that we truly desire. And this is a visual for you to think that through, even just in the day or even a typical hour, that we have all of these integrated ingredients that are happening as we set up class, as kids transition, we start teaching, and during class, ending class, and after class. We want to have our educators understand that this is integrated work. We don't use a recipe approach to just do the thing at a certain time, but it all is happening continuously as we engage with students. And that's really the big picture here, that we want to be able to enable and empower our educators to see that this is the work that we do. Now we're going to support you with concrete strategies, because if we're going to get this cookie, well, if we're going to actually be able to replicate it over time, what do we have to do, Corey?
Well, we got to do ongoing implementation.
Absolutely. Ongoing implementation is so huge. So yes, it's great that we may have trained and created this context, but we really then have to go back and say, what are we doing well? What is our current need that we still might have? And what might we need to add on to continue to fine tune our recipe over time? But if we're going to create that chocolate chip cookie experience for our students over time, we've got to get that recipe. We got to dial it in. And it has to be replicable, and we can support that with ongoing implementation and a team of people that's dedicated to this tier 1 work, because we know that you cannot be successful without a dedicated team that's accountable for this implementation. So we've provided you an opportunity in your tier 1 rubric to really assess your teaming. What does teaming look like around this work in your system? Where might you be really successful, and opportunities to grow? And just to remind you here, those yellow spots are for you to put in the score. And then there's those boxes at the bottom, right in your action steps. Where are you headed to the future? Where are those opportunities for growth? And dig into this with your team. So Corey,
so next steps, yeah, the next steps here, download the rubric. You got it now. Take it back to your team. Reflect on what's currently going on in your school. Create an action plan for how you might address some of those areas. and get ready for next year, because you've got, some of you have no days left with students, some of you have 15, but we know you're preparing for next year before you walk out those doors. So take it to your team, think through it, attend another demo like this. We do deeper dives into specific areas that we were talking about. Attend one of our conferences that we'll talk about in just a minute, but download the samples at least, see what it looks like. And if you're really interested in our tier 1 solution or our tier 2 solution, which we didn't talk about, feel free to request a quote. Today was all about equipping educators, all of you, with the things that you need to be successful as you move forward throughout the rest of this year and into next. So join us again at an upcoming demo. We've got one on May 30th for professional development. We got the gym, as well as elementary demos going on, secondary demos June 2nd, another elementary one followed on the 5th, and a tier 2 demo on June 7th. And if you haven't thought about it, Megan mentioned it, check out our school culture training. Great opportunity to bring your whole staff along in this process and really create a greater opportunity for students to belong, be well, and engage in a classroom environment. And just 2 more updates. National conference is coming up. If you haven't registered yet, don't worry, the early bird is still on. And that's July 28th and 29th in Tacoma. And last but not least, if you're coming to the national conference, come a little early. Join Megan, me, and Clay at the Tier 2 certification training on July 25th and 26th. Megan, I appreciate you being here. Hope you have a good rest of the day and a good rest of the year. And good luck as you work on your tier 1 practices. We know you'll be doing well once they're firmly in place.
Awesome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. If you have any additional questions, feel free to stay on after and we will answer those.
And Sheila, I wanted to, well, if you're still on, I'm not sure if you're still on, I didn't look, but you asked about some research related to our 4th, the 1+1 more. And I wanted to make sure you had a document that you could make a copy of that has the research information and a little bit more about what that practice specifically looks like. Drop it in the chat now for you if you're still there. If not, we'll try to follow up if you've already dropped off. And then Erica asked a question. Megan, do you see that about what to expect at the SEL curriculum demo?
Oh yeah, great question, Erica. So what you'll do is you'll just go to the respective one, if it's elementary or secondary or tier 2, we just walk you through our solutions, really how we've created it, how you can dig in, what the different components are of each of the solution, and suggestions for bringing that to life in your system. You get to have a little sneak peek sample of what is ahead for SEL and Character Ed.
Great. Thank you all again for
Erica, good idea. And Erica, if you sign up for the demo, you can attend and then you'll get the recording as well. So if your administrative team's not able to attend, you can take that recording and certainly watch it with them later.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Have a good day. See you, Megan.
All right. Bye, Corey.